Hi. So I thought you spoke very eloquently about the immigrant experience and the American dream, but you're supporting the candidate who has a much more prohibitive stance on immigration and has talked about banning members of one of the world's largest religions from coming to this country. So I wonder how you respond to kind of the conflict between those things.
That's a good question, which basically says, gee, you know, you've made this passionate argument against bigotry. Hey, aren't you advocating for a bigot? Aren't you advocating for somebody who wants to block immigration, keep the Muslims out, makes these kind of bigoted remarks? I want to address this frontally because, first of all, if it is Trump's position that America should not let in any Muslims, I don't believe that is his position, by the way. If he said it, he's clarified it subsequently. But if it is his position now, I don't agree with it. But I will say this. Our country does need, in this age of terrorism, very careful vetting. We live in an age when most of the terrorists who want to kill us, no, let me put it differently, most Muslims are not terrorists. But it is also true that most of the terrorists who want to kill us are Muslims. So, this means that we need a particularly careful vetting from Islamic nations. This is not to say that people can't be converts to Islam, that we can't have homegrown terrorism, but the simple truth of the matter is just look around the world. The Mumbai bombing, the Bali bombing, the Madrid bombing, 9/11, the list goes on. And this is not a fault of religion. Where are the Korean suicide bombers? So this is not a case of religion. This is a case of a particular toxicity in a particular religion at this moment in history. It takes a certain realism to see the world in the face. And that's the reality. I think to that degree, Trump has a realism about him. Now, Trump has said things that are, I think, at times thoughtless and even insensitive. But insensitive is not racist. Insensitivity is not bigotry. He called some guy a Mexican. Now that's an American guy of Mexican descent. Not probably the right way to describe him. It's kind of like looking at me. I'm an American of Indian descent. You call me an Indian. Well, I may not like it, but that doesn't make you a racist. So when you look at the actual history of racism, it essentially involves considering people intrinsically inferior, locking them up, burning them up, denying them jobs. Trump has done none of that. So it's an absolute perversion of the term racism to take an epithet or a phrase and link traditional, ancestral, you may call it, real racism with, you may say, careless talk. Hopefully Trump has learned from this experience. Look, he's an outsider. When you get an outsider, you get the benefits of somebody who is untutored in politics, is even unvetted, and you get some of the risks of that. So when I look at it, I say Trump is a politician and a public figure in the making. And I'm more concerned of not even so much about who he was. He grew up in a rough neighborhood. He hung around with rough people. He learned to talk in rough ways. The question I have is he going to talk like that in the White House? My expectation is no. But even if he did, I'd still take that over Hillary.
A friend, she asked, wondering, after all that you've been through, do you regret making the movies?
I regret making them quite as moderate as they are. Every now and then a kind of cloud of rhino suspicion crosses my own mind, and then I've got to fortify myself and go for it.
Hey, so just one question. With your conviction, doesn't the Eighth Amendment, didn't what they did to you violate the Eighth Amendment because what they did was cruel and unusual psychological testing, and you being the first person convicted of that crime, unusual?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that would be a valid constitutional objection. Now, certainly it is a little weird to take an offense which is exceeding the campaign finance law and order the defendant, me, to undergo mandatory psychiatric testing. I mean, we're not in Cuba. This isn't the Soviet Union. And the kind of crimes for which you normally get mandatory psychology in America, you have to be Jeffrey Dahmer. You have to put bodies in the refrigerator, and people will go, what would make a guy do that? Well, in my question, the question is, what would make a guy who's never given to political campaigns before want to give 20 grand to a longtime college friend of his who's running for office? That doesn't require psychological therapy. So this reflects the kind of nuttiness of modern liberalism, this idea that people who disagree aren't wrong, they're actually screwed up, and they need medical attention. But all I can say about the attempted rehabilitation is that...
Anybody wants to join, please find me. My question comes that I seen that this was supposed to be the moral defense to build the wall. And we can argue whether we need to secure our borders and stop immigrants from coming in. But is the question really about using eminent domain to take people's private property to build a wall? Or is it about finding a way to sustain our border to stop people from being able to scale it? Like you said, Stanford has found a way to prevent intruders without a physical wall. Shouldn't the U.S. aspire to do just as good as Stanford is?
I take your question to be asking not a question about whether we need a wall, but what kind of a wall? And I'm using the term wall here metaphorically. You seem to agree. This reminds me a little bit, by the way, of Frost's poem Mending Wall. Because in Mending Wall, you've got a neighbor who's railing against his neighbor for building a wall, right? But while he's railing on the neighbor for building a wall, he never claims the right to go into his neighbor's property. He never claims the right to take his neighbor's stuff. He accepts the need for a wall. He just doesn't like the wall. He thinks it could be done a different way. And I agree with you. Let me suggest this way. If you have a better suggestion for how to actually enforce security on the southern border, let's just say through a combination of various techniques, you should propose it. I think, see, the problem is these topics are never debated. They're never debated. Right now, the debate is frozen between the wall or, in effect, porous borders. It's a very bad debate. We should actually be debating what is the best way to enforce security on the southern border. And I'm not dogmatic about that. I'm open to all kinds of ideas. I think Trump's point in emphasizing the wall is simply this, that for now 30 years, there are these bogus debates about fixing immigration and things like what do we do with all the illegals who are in America and so on. None of those problems can be seriously considered until a country has a real border. Now, again, you seem to agree there should be a border. There's just a better way to do it.
I don't agree with using eminent domain to take citizens' private property.
Ever?
And your analogy, and I'm not being rude, I admire what you're doing, but your analogy is flawed because the neighbor building the wall, in order for your analogy to work, the neighbor would have to step over my property line, take my property, and try to build that wall on my property. And that's what eminent domain does, is it takes private citizens' property. Now, we can argue over how secure a border needs to be and how to go about it. But when you begin the argument with we need to forcefully take somebody's stuff, that is not a good foundation to start with.
Let me ask you this. In the settling of America, do you think that eminent domain should have been prohibited?
Do I think prohibited?
Yeah, you're building a railroad that's running, let's just say, from New York to California, and there's a group of people in the way who have homes and they don't want to sell, and they don't want to sell at any price. What do you think should happen?
I believe all alternatives should be considered, and if it's ruled that there's no other way to do it but that, and it's in the national security, then I'd say yes. But the problem is the argument has become more about, I want a wall to feel good about seeing a wall, rather than I want to make sure my border is secure.
I'm in the second camp. Okay, let's keep going.
I'm Bill Evers. I wondered if you would say something about Professor Jeffrey Hart of Dartmouth, who just died, and I believe was a mentor of yours. And I think people here, particularly students, would be interested in your experience.
The question is about a dear and influential professor of mine, Jeff Hart, who was a deputy of Bill Buckley's at National Review. He was a very interesting character because actually in his later years he became a leftist. He became a Democrat, He became a champion of Obama, and yet he has a whole generation of Dartmouth students who are conservative, spread out in all kinds of industries that he shaped and influenced. And so it's actually been for us very sort of bittersweet to watch, you may say, the evolution of Jeffrey Hart. In his later years, I would have these knockdown debate arguments with him about Obama. He would say things like, Dinesh, you have to admit Bush was a complete idiot, and Obama is a genuine constitutional scholar. And I said, Jeff, Obama, who is a smart guy, don't get me wrong, but has never published a scholarly article on the Constitution or any other subject in any scholarly journal in his life. And he'd be like, what about the book Reading Obama by this guy Kloppenberg? I'm like, go read that book. This is an example of fake history. So this Kloppenberg is a Harvard historian. Kloppenberg will quote Obama saying things like, I'm a pragmatist. And then from that phrase, Kloppenberg goes, pragmatism, C.S. Peirce, William James, the early 20th century pragmatist, debating the nature of truth. Here's Obama saying the truth itself is up for grabs. Obama's saying none of the above. He's probably never heard of Peirce. He's probably barely heard of William James. This is like the movie with Chance the Gardener. You take pedestrian statements, infuse meaning into them, and declare the guy to be the smartest guy since Oliver Wendell Holmes. I mean, this to me is intellectual sleight of hand. It's embarrassing. Now, Hart was well into his 80s when we had these debates. When I was 17 years old, I thought of conservatives as really boring people who had toothbrush mustaches and walked around with umbrellas. And I thought, I don't want to be that. And then when I met Jeffrey Hart, this was a guy who had played in the U.S. Open. This was a guy who was colorful, outrageous, comical, one of the few people who could make you laugh out loud, and was genuinely interested in ideas. He showed me a whole world of books and ideas I'd never heard of. I was a kid off the boat, you might say, from India. And I thought to myself, here's a whole world of knowledge, and here's a whole set of answers, and I didn't even know they were questions. So it was very important to my intellectual development to be exposed to that. And I came to understand, people said, well, Dinesh, when did you convert? When did you become a conservative? And it occurred to me I never did. It was more like I immersed myself in conservative ideas, and I recognized that I'd always been a conservative. It was more a form of awakening than it was a conversion from one thing to another. And I think this is, by the way, true of most Asian Americans. We are conservative in our bones, and conservatism is a reflection of the things we already know and the way we already live. It merely articulates those ideas.